Thank you so much, Kieran. When I was little, Legos were my favorite toy, and I used to love and was thrilled to play with those things every day. I loved Legos. And many years for Christmas, there would be a particular Lego set, typically a larger one, that I would ask for Christmas. And I remember one year, the particular set that I asked for was a Lego police headquarters, and I had been in exacting detail communicating to Santa Claus exactly what it was that I wanted, and I was just absolutely ecstatic to get up on Christmas morning, to go into the living room and open up this big package, and there inside was the Lego police headquarters. Now that meant for me, though, that I had some work stretched out for me for the rest of Christmas Day, and the bulk of that Christmas I spent assembling all these little bricks together to make this police headquarters. And there were a lot of pieces to it. It had a little motorcycle, it had a police car, there was a jail, there was an office, there was a second level that held, there was a helipad and a helicopter, and then there was a little office with a radio tower on top of it, and I was just thrilled to have this. And I'm sitting there with the instruction booklet, and if you've ever put Lego sets together, you've got this book with all these various pages in there, and each page has various pictures that show the individual steps where you take a brick of this size and put it in this spot, and then the next step, all these different pictures. And so for hours and hours I have spent piecing this thing together, and now I'm almost done. I'm really excited. And I know that I'm almost done because there's not many pieces left. And all of a sudden, I realize there's a problem. I'm working on the second level of this police headquarters, and it's an office where the radio tower is supposed to be. And the instructions are calling for some pieces that I don't see in my remaining pile. In fact, the pieces that I have left, the instructions aren't calling for those pieces at all. All of a sudden, it dawns on me, I've messed this thing up. That there are some pieces that I have used earlier that I shouldn't have used, and pieces that I should have used I have not. And so now I've got an option, something to decide. Either I can piece this thing together as best I can with what I have left, or I can go back and start all over. So what did I do? I opted for the former, and that was to piece it as best I could together with what I had. And it looked okay, it really did. And I was able to cover up some places where some bricks were missing. But the problem was that as you played with this, that second level was increasingly unstable. And so regularly you'd have to stop to put it back together because it was literally falling apart. Why did I experience that? Because I didn't want to go back and make sure that I got things right from the start. You know, in truth, oftentimes as believers, there are people that have, relative to their walk with God, a very similar type of experience. And that is that when you or I or anybody begins a relationship with Christ, when individuals become a Christian, there's this growth process that begins to take place. And you're learning from the Spirit of God, you're learning from the Bible, you're learning from Sunday school teachers and preachers and other believers. But beyond that, you're also being influenced by culture and by the media, and all these influencers are weighing in on you. And bit by bit, what you are doing is assembling a faith, a belief system where all these individual pieces are being added to a structure. And all too often what happens is that in this process, we can use some pieces that we shouldn't use. We can overlook some pieces that we actually should use, and we wind up with a belief set, with a structure that has some bad wood in it, that has some warped beams. And then as the influence of culture begins to weigh in on us, or just the weight of life and the circumstances, the trials that we go through, as those things begin to weigh in on this faith that's been improperly built, then stress fractures begin to show. And too many times faith can begin to crumble. What we need to make sure that we do is that at the very least in our minds that we go back and we make sure that we have built right from the ground up. Now, such is a problem that's not exclusive to the experience of believers today. It was something that was experienced in the first century, particularly among a group of believers in the city of Colossae. And Paul wrote a letter to them that we have recorded for us today that we know as the book of Colossians. And as he is writing this letter to them, he's aware that they have been influenced. And as they have been growing in their faith, they have added some bricks that shouldn't be there. And they've got some conclusions that are not correct, that are not founded in biblical truth or reality. And so what he did was to write to them and to communicate in a letter to help them to go back in their minds to make sure that they have built correctly from the ground up. In fact, he even states his goal in writing to them in chapter 2 of Colossians. He says, "As you have received Christ, so walk in him, rooted and built up in him and established in the faith." Rooted and built up in him, established in the faith. This morning we're beginning a series where we're going to be walking through the book of Colossians in a series that I've entitled, using Paul's words, they're rooted and built up. And so the encouragement for those Colossian believers, I think, quite frankly, is the encouragement that we need to take as well today. And that is to, at least in our minds, to go back and start at the beginning and make sure that we have built correctly from the ground up. And if we're starting and going back to the basics, what is it that we need to understand? Well, Paul communicates that to us today in the first chapter of Colossians. If you would look with me there, Colossians chapter 1, and we'll begin reading today with verse 9. Colossians chapter 1, starting with verse 9. There Paul says this, "For this reason we also, since the day we heard it, do not cease to pray for you, and to ask that you may be filled with the knowledge of His will in all wisdom and spiritual understanding, that you may walk worthy of the Lord, fully pleasing Him, being fruitful in every good work and increasing in the knowledge of God, strengthened with all might according to His glorious power for all patience and long-suffering with joy, giving thanks to the Father who has qualified us to be partakers of the inheritance of the saints in the light. He has delivered us from the power of darkness and conveyed us into the kingdom of the Son of His love, in whom we have redemption through His blood, the forgiveness of sins." Again, he's taking them back to the basics, and he's saying, these are the things that you need to know. Well, if we're going to be thinking along those lines, what is it that God, through Paul, is saying that we need to know? Well, first of all, we need to know that God has a will that can be known. God has a will that can be known. Well, as I said at the outset, this is a letter that Paul wrote to the believers that comprised a church in the city of Colossae. Now, you're familiar with the fact probably that Paul went on a varied number of missionary journeys, going to a slew of different cities, and the plan was always the same, and the method was similar in each of the places, and that was that he would go and he would tell people about Jesus, and he would lead them to begin a personal relationship with the Lord. Once he's got a few of those together, then he helps them to form a church, a fellowship. And once he works with them and helps train and they begin to reach others, then he goes to another city and does the same thing. So Paul planted a slew of different churches in a slew of different cities, but Colossae was not one of them. Now, he had been to the city, and it seems that he had been able to meet a number of these believers, but Paul did not actually plant this church. This was one that was actually seemingly planted by his partners in ministry, Timothy and Epaphras. But though he did not plant this church, he was concerned for them, and he wanted something sincere for them, and that was to make sure that these were believers that had a walk with God that was not simply meaningful, but was properly founded. And the reason for that was that Colossae was a city that had been very much experiencing a lot of difficulty economically. It used to be at the crossroads of some major trade routes. But I guess they, in the first century, had put in a bypass, they'd put in a loop, and so Colossae was no longer the city that it once was. Economic systems and structures begin to wane. Jobs and money and all of these things seem to be diminishing. In many ways, Colossae is a city that has its glory days in the rearview mirror. But the greatest challenge that people in Colossae faced, specifically the believers, was not an economic threat. It was a threat to their faith. And the reason is that they have sought to grow and add building blocks to their faith, and along the way they have been influenced by a series of false teachers who have told them some things that are not at all biblical, communicated some truth that was not at all truth. And so he writes this letter to them. And in the opening verses, he's offering some introductory remarks. He's praising them. He's saying things like in verse 3 that we give thanks to the God of our Father and our Lord Jesus Christ, praying always for you. He praises them for their love for each other, for the hope that they have. And he praises them for their hard work. He's saying, guys, you've been diligent in serving God, and you've expensed a lot of effort and work and energy in helping others to know Him. But by the time you get to verse 9, he is changing his mood a bit, and he expresses what his desire for them is. And you actually see it where he says, for this reason, also, since the day we heard it, we do not cease to pray for you. And so he's saying, guys, I want you to know that I have been praying for you. I have made it an intentional point to talk to God about you. And of all the things that Paul could have prayed for all the requests that he could have petitioned God for on their behalf, we see what he prayed for. He prayed and asked God that they might be filled with the knowledge of God's will and all wisdom and spiritual understanding. He's praying that they might come to know, and know to its fullest extent, the will of God. Now, the words that Paul uses there, phrases or words like knowledge and understanding and wisdom, these are not accidental word uses by the Apostle Paul. Keep in mind what he's writing is occurring in late 1st century A.D. Now, by the time you get to the 2nd century, there is a philosophical movement known as Gnosticism. It's based on the Greek word for knowledge, gnosis. And so this movement called Gnosticism begins, and what it teaches is that the material world, everything you can see and touch, all that stuff is evil. Furthermore, there's no God, there's no heaven, but what we need to pursue is some mystical level of knowledge that transcends everything that we experience. That's what we need to be pursuing. And throughout this letter, Paul is going to be using words like knowledge and wisdom and understanding, aware of the fact that the seeds of that philosophy have already been sown in the city of Colossae. But he says to them, listen, I could talk to God about anything. I could ask Him for anything for you. I could pray for strength in the face of opposition. I could pray for courage. I could pray for tenacity. I could pray for all these things. But specifically what he prays for them is what? That they might be filled with the knowledge of God's will and all wisdom and spiritual understanding. Now, the manner in which he phrases that communicates that this is not a pursuit. This is not a quest like normally you undertake. This is not knowledge that can be gained by going to the library and checking out a book and reading it. This is not a quest that can be satisfied by going to a series of classes or seminars or discussion groups. This is a spiritual enterprise that requires spiritual resources. And he's saying, what I am praying for you is that you might come to know the will of God. Now, I say all of that to communicate something to you very simple. And though simple, it's altogether important. The God who made everything, the one who knows everything, has a will. God has a will as to how everything is to unfold and how things are to transpire. But it's insufficient merely to say that God has a will, because Paul is communicating not only does the God who made everything and knows everything have a will, but He has a will that He's made possible for you to know. That's a simple truth, but it's an altogether encouraging reality that you as a follower of God, someone that's in a personal relationship with Him, He has a will and a plan for purpose for how things are to unfold, and it's not some secret that He is just kind of covering His work so that you can't peek over and see. He's wanting to disclose it. He is seeking to reveal it, and you and I can experience and come to the point where we know and understand what God's will, His plan, and His purposes are. Well, to understand and to further drive that point home, think with me about this reality. Most of you here today have a cell phone. And you recognize that cell phones are kind of a double-edged sword. They're a blessing and a curse. They're a blessing because they make us always available, but they're a curse because they make us always available. But you recognize that always available is not completely accurate, because there are plenty of places that you can go. You might have experienced this where you're trying to make a call and you got no service, right? I'm from Charlotte, and if you've been in and through Charlotte very much, you have probably been on Independence Boulevard. Independence Boulevard is the single busiest road in North and South Carolina. More cars travel that road than any other road in 2 states. But while we lived there was on Independence Boulevard, there's a big gold building, if you're familiar with that. It's near Sharon Amity, and every time I would pass that building, if I was on the phone, I'd lose the call. If you called me and I passed the building, I'd lose it. If I called you and I passed that building, I would lose it. It was enormously frustrating, and consistently every single time, if I'm on the phone and I pass that building, I've hit this dead spot and I cannot hear. I've lost the ability to communicate. Now, I could complain about that and gripe about that, and I did. But it didn't change anything. Every time I would pass that building, I would lose the signal. I would not be able to hear. The only remedy to this was to get to the right place, to get beyond that. And once I got to the right place, then, and only then, was I able to hear. I believe very much the will of God to work in very much the same way. God is not trying to keep it a secret. He's not trying to cloak it in some veiled mystery. But for you and I, or for the Colossian believers to be able to come to understand what the will of God is, you got to get in the right place to be able to hear it. Well, what's the right place? Well, Paul actually communicated that to us in the 12th chapter of Romans, actually in verse 1. Perhaps you remember it where he says this, I beseech you, so I'm begging you, brethren, he says, by the mercies of God. In view of all that God has done for you, I'm asking you, pleading with you to do something. First of all, present your bodies as a living sacrifice to God. Say, God, here I am, all of me. And then he says, do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. So you say, God, here I am, all of me. And God, I'm making the intentional choice that I don't want to just go along to get along. I don't want to conform myself to the drift of culture, but I want to be transformed by you. And Paul says that when we do that, then we're able to know and prove that which is the good and pleasing and perfect will of God. God has a will that can be known. You don't find it out by checking out a library book. You don't find it out by going to a particular seminar or class. You get into the right spot. You say, God, here I am, all of me. And I'm choosing that I want to be transformed by you. And when you get to that place, then the lines of connectivity are able to be established. And you are able to, as the Colossians were able to, come to discover what the perfect will of God actually is. God has a will that can be known. But beyond that, Paul communicates this. God has an expectation He makes possible. God has an expectation He makes possible. Not only does Paul in verse 9 pray that they might come to know the will of God, but he desires and prays that once they come to discover that it translates itself into some real action. Action that you see in verse 10. He says that you may walk worthy of the Lord, fully pleasing to Him. So I'm praying that you might come to know the will of God, and once you know that, I'm praying that you may walk worthy of Him. Now, what does it mean to walk worthy of God? Or for your walk with God to be worthy of Him? Well, think about it this way. You have probably been into a slew of different stores where as you're leaving, you pass by the little gumball machines, and they've got candy and they've got little toys and trinkets trying to get little kids to beg their parents for quarters so that they can lose them into these junk pots. All right, so you know those. You've probably also seen at some of these locations that they'll have a bigger machine that has all these stuffed animals in there with this crane that you can put $1 in, and it'll go over and supposedly pick up a stuffed animal, and you can get your very own stuffed animal. Well, you understand, these things are rigged, right? And they're rigged because the stuffed animals are placed in there in such a way that they're confining on each other, and that claw is not strong enough, generally speaking, to pick up any of these. And you'll think that you can actually win, when in truth, the only thing you're going to win is disappointment. Now, there are some exceptions. I remember as a teenager going with our youth group, we'd gone on a trip to Atlanta, and one of the places that we went to was the Underground in Atlanta. I guess it's still there. I don't know, I wish they'd covered it up and left it underground, but it was a shopping center, and we just kind of split up. We were killing some time, and I was with some friends in the arcade there at the Underground. And in this arcade, they had one of these little claw things with the stuffed animals inside. And apparently what had happened is that by some fluke, by some miracle, somebody had actually gotten a stuffed animal out of there. And that upset the apple cart, so the rest of them were kind of loose. I'd never tried one of these before, so I thought, well, I'll stick my dollar in there. I get one. Holy cow, I've got a stuffed animal. I'm brilliant. How are other people not figuring this thing out? I've got one. Let me put another dollar in there. I got another one. By the time I stopped, I have 10 stuffed animals. I've conquered the world. I mean, some people are trying to cure cancer. I figured out the crane thing. Top that. And so I'm all excited. I'm thrilled. Man, look at what I have done. And then I step back and I kind of look at what I've done. I got all these stuffed animals. I don't want any stuffed animals. I didn't want one. I've got 10 of them. Besides that, I'm now out $10. I spent $10 to get this, and I don't even want this. And my disappointment at that point is based on this. What I've got, I've discovered, is not worth what I paid. What I got is not worth what I paid. Take that mindset and go back to what Paul says when he prays that those believers might walk worthy of the Lord. To walk worthy of the Lord. I believe the thought is this, and I believe it to be a pretty significant, weighty thought, that my life and your life, that our walks with Him ought to be lived in such a way that in our life before Him is worth what He paid. That's a weighty thought, isn't it? I mean, considering the inordinate price that God paid for us in Christ, that what He got becomes worth what He paid. Well, that's tough. That's tough. Because Paul says, I want you to walk worthy of Him, fully pleasing to Him. That's awfully tough. That's erecting a very high standard and raising the bar enormously high. In fact, the bad news is you can't do that. I can't do that. I mean, you can work day and night, and you cannot fully achieve that standard. But how in the world can it ever be achieved? How can we walk fully pleasing to Him? How is it that we can actually live a life that's worth what He paid for us? Well, you see it in verse 11. Strengthened with all might according to His glorious power. What I'm saying to you is that God has erected this standard, this expectation that He wants you to live in such a way that your life and your walk with Him is worth what He paid for you. But because of His power, that becomes possible. When instead of leaning on your own ability and your own ingenuity, that you say, you know what, God, I recognize that you want my life to be used to count. You want my life to be used for eternal consequence. You want to use my life in ways that are helping to accomplish this will that you've made known to me. And God, I cannot do that on my own, but I recognize that you have limitless power, and so I'm leaning hard and I'm leaning strong into you. What he's saying is that God has an expectation that God alone makes possible. Perhaps it was that the Colossian believers had some difficulty with that. They thought they could do things on their own. Very easily and very subtly we get to that point as well. We begin to erect systems and structures and create ministries, and oftentimes do so with the best of intentions, having the most admirable of goals, patting ourselves along the back, saying, hey, we along the way that we've got this taken care of. We've got a good plan. And then when nothing happens, when nothing of consequence occurs, we wonder why. Well, it's because we've been depending on our own ability, our own power. Paul says, listen, not only does God have a will that can be known, but He has a standard, an expectation that He and He alone makes possible. But there's a final reality that He communicates in this passage, which is this. God does work that makes Him worthy of thanks. God does work that makes Him worthy of thanks. Because of what God has done, there is much an awful lot for which we are to be thankful. Specifically, Paul says in verse 12, we are to be giving thanks to the Father who has qualified us to be partakers of the inheritance of the saints in the light. That's kind of a wordy phrase, isn't it? That God's qualified us to be partakers of the inheritance of the saints in the light. Well, what's that? It's salvation. It's heaven. Put that back together, and Paul's saying we should be giving thanks to God who has qualified us for salvation, who has qualified us for heaven, who has qualified us for forgiveness, who has qualified us for a relationship with Him. Because He has done this, He's saying, and not simply suggesting, but that what should naturally come from this is that we are giving thanks. The simple reality is that those who have a personal relationship with Christ, those that say, hey, yeah, I'm a Christian and I'm a follower of God, we ought to be the absolute most thankful people on the face of God's green earth. And the reason for that is because we understand altogether what it is that God has done for us. Notice what he says, that God has qualified us. God has qualified us. Do you recognize that on your own you're not qualified, you're not fit for heaven? You recognize on your own you're not qualified, you're not fit to have a relationship with God. On your own you're not qualified, you're not fit to be able to be forgiven. On your own you're not qualified for any of this stuff. But he says you're able to experience it because God has done this. Why is it that we are, or I am, or anybody is unqualified? Well, it seems that there's a basic need that we have, something for which that we're lacking in. And what is that lack? Well, I think the lack is righteousness, right standing with God. Now, the Old Testament says that our righteousness, our own goodness, is like filthy, dirty, stinking rags. Paul says in the book of Romans, there's none righteous, no, not one, none of us. We need that, but we don't have it. But the good news is he says that God has qualified us to be partakers in this. And what he did was to take the righteousness of Christ and put that on our side of the ledger so that our debt before him is paid in full. What he does is to account Christ's righteousness for ours and to say, you're now qualified for this. I mean, that's good news. That makes salvation completely the work of God. All we do is respond to it. He does all the work. He does all the heavy lifting. He's qualified us to be partakers of this, but he continues by saying, not only has he qualified us for this, rather he has delivered us from the power of darkness and conveyed us into the kingdom of the Son of his love. Conveyed us into the kingdom of the Son of his love. Every time I see the word conveyed, it makes me think of conveyor belt. And when I think of conveyor belt, I think of service merchandise. Remember service merchandise? And that was kind of an interesting store. And some of you may have to explain to your children how that store worked. It's been gone now for quite some time. But I remember, in particular, as a child going to service merchandise, and it was different than any other store. Now, like other stores, they had products for sale, and there are all these displays and different counters, and there was electronics and housewares and all the various different departments of this store. But you would see what you want, and you didn't just pick up one off the shelf and go pay for it. What you did was to pick up a clipboard and one of those little pencils, and you say, oh, let me get that code. And you would write the code down for all the items that you want. And then you would take that slip of paper over to a cash register, and then they would ring you up, and then that sheet would go back to the warehouse. So you've paid for this, you found what you wanted, you paid for it, and then you go over to a receiving area. And all you can see is this conveyor belt coming out of a wall, this big long thing, and items are beginning to come down from it. And what's going on is that somebody back in the warehouse has pulled your TV or your lamp or your knickknack or whatever it is that you wanted. They've taken it off the shelf, and they put it on that conveyor belt. And as you stand there and watch with unending excitement, I remember as a little kid just, there it comes, there it comes. You'd see that coming down the conveyor belt. But conveyor belts are very simple because what they do is this. They take what you want from where it is to where you want it to be. They take what you want from where it is to where you want it to be. In a similar fashion, the work of God operates like a conveyor belt. It takes you from where you are to where you want to be. Notice what he says. He has delivered us from the power of darkness and He has conveyed us into the kingdom of the Son of His love, in whom we have redemption. In Him we have the forgiveness of sins. He takes what we want from where it is to where we want it to be, right here. And what should that spawn? What should that generate? Absolute thankfulness, absolute gratitude, because God has and does work that is absolutely worthy and deserving of our thanks. I recognize these are not complicated thoughts. These are foundational realities, but Paul recognized every believer needs to make sure they've got these things straight. That God does have a will that can be known, that He has an expectation that He makes possible, and that He does work that's deserving of thanks. In fact, in view of what God has done, I think Isaac Watts had it best when he penned in that great hymn of the faith, "When I Survey the Wondrous Cross," he says, in view of what God has done, this love so amazing, this love so divine, deserves my life, my soul, my all. Love so amazing, so divine, it deserves my life, my soul, my all. God deserves that from you, but the question very simply is, does He have it? Does He have it? Will you bow your heads with me? I'm guessing for most folks here this morning, we haven't broken new ground, unlocked great insight, but just reminded ourselves of foundational, basic truth. Sometimes we absolutely need that because we can get carried away with some things that don't really matter. But one thing that really does matter is the expectation of God that my life and your life is worthy of Him. I said earlier it's a weighty thought, and it is for me, and I hope it is for you. My encouragement for you is to prayerfully ask God this: God, is the life that I'm living, did you get what you paid for? Is my life and my service for you, is it really worth the high price that you paid? And if that's a thought and an answer that brings conviction, God wants something to change. Maybe a lot of things to change. I can't tell you what they are, but God through His Spirit can. In response to what you've heard this morning, it could very well be that God's calling you to have an honest and candid conversation with Him. Maybe it is it's in your pew or it's kneeling at this altar and say, Lord, I have been reminded of the depths of your love for me, the great work you've done for me. And you deserve, that love deserves my life, my soul, my all. And up until now, I can't say that you've had it. But God, I want to give it to you. Maybe there's another decision God's prompting you to make. Perhaps it is to begin or find out how you can begin a relationship with Him. Maybe you want me or someone to pray with you this morning. This is your opportunity. Perhaps it is that God's been leading you to become a part of this church family. This is your chance. Maybe there's just a burden you want to talk to God about. This is your opportunity just to leave this with God. Lord, we just want to thank you for your word. Thank you that you have made it possible for us to come to know your will, the plans and purposes that you have, not simply for the world, but even for us. Thank you, God, that though you've got a standard and an expectation that our lives are to be lived worthy of what you paid for us, you've made even that possible. And because of all you've done, Lord, you're absolutely and completely deserving of our deepest thanks and gratitude. Lord, as we've been reminded that you, for some, might have brought some feelings of conviction. There's some feelings right now that aren't altogether easy, altogether pleasant. And it's because you're prompting choices to be made, different choices to be made. God, as you've spoken to our hearts, as you have and are guiding us to make different decisions, I pray, God, that we would follow you in faith and in obedience. We commit this time of decision to you in Christ's name. Amen. I'm going to ask if you would to stand as Tom and our praise team lead us in the hymn of invitation. As God has spoken to you, respond this morning.